afternoon and good day to everyone. And thank you for joining us online. I am really happy, honored, and excited to be joined by Professor Simon Evenett here to talk about the shifting winds in trade policy. I mean, if you think about it today and looking at our region in here, there is no other topic that has occupied us the last 6 months, we economists, people working on strategy, geopolitics, than what's happening in world trade and the geopolitical. For me, it's like you take a boat, you sail the boat. We always think of wind coming into the sails as a blessing, but every now and then you get wind that will make your boat drift left, right, and center. And this is exactly where we find ourselves in now. So shifting winds, our boats are sailing not in the same direction, and now we're trying to avoid even our boats hitting rocks. And therefore, it's very timely for me to actually host with us here at White Shield offices, Professor Simon Evenett. You're very famous across the globe. You're on LinkedIn, talking about the impact, tracing every single move at the very detailed level, what's happening in trade, supply chains, who's doing what to whom, and what the impacts are. So it's a great pleasure to have you here, Professor Evenett. You are a professor now at IMD. You run also the Global Trade Alert, a tool that I used since 2008. I was at that time at the OECD trying to trace back what was happening in the wake of the financial crisis and its impact on the OECD members and what policies to do and all that. So it's a great pleasure to have you here. I took advantage of your visit to Dubai to actually invite you. This is the second time you come here, right? At least to our offices. And therefore, without further ado, let me start. Let's dive in straight away and say, let's start the conversation with one trend. I mean, we all know what's been happening the last 6 months, in terms of the trade policy. What one trend or one event that has taken place that people have not actually paid attention to or enough attention to?
So the one thing I recommend you all track is how the next generation of goods and services that firms are innovating will take account of security. So take something as humble as a wind turbine. Okay, wind turbines have parts and components and sensors from countries which are on one side of a geopolitical divide, China. And in some parts of the world, this will no longer be seen as acceptable. So expect the next generation of wind turbines to be redesigned in a way that keeps what some people will see as potentially unreliable. And wind turbines is not the only business that's going to happen. So I think the securitization of trade and the fact that it's now being linked to national security concerns, that you've all heard of. But think 5-10 years ahead about what that's going to mean for a whole range of technologies which have digital implications and which essentially those markets are going to become, I would argue, sealed off from certain parts of the world.
So today traceability is not just enough, to trace.
Traceability won't be enough. There will be customers, both private sector and public sector, who will want assurances that there can be no transmission of data across borders back to a geopolitical rival, and no potential for cross-border control of critical infrastructure or other types of even just machinery, which is central to security of supply. So I think that is where we're going.
But so what implications for customs officials, for ports, that are connected, especially that have now connectivity to all parts of the world and trying to play the game as fairly and as securely as possible?
Yeah, so I think what governments in each jurisdiction are going to have to decide is, do they share this fear that a critical piece of infrastructure or technology could be manipulated from afar, and do they worry about it? And if they don't, then you can pretty much carry on sourcing the cheapest technologies and the best technology, the best value for money technologies, let's put it in those terms. You can keep sourcing them from around the world. What you will see instead in Europe and the United States and in the US as allies, you'll see a movement of defining the next generation of regulations and safety and procurement regulations by governments so as to keep out these problems. And that's where I think we're going with this. And this is the way in which essentially in some industries, for example, Fortress Europe will be created. And we are already seeing it in the United States with electric vehicles, where they have managed to project their influence also to Canada, who's taken their. So I think that is the EV decisions in the US last year under President Biden, remember, that was the canary in the mine.
So let me then bring it back to what has taken shape today in terms of the US-EU agreement, the US-Japan agreement, US-Korea, and all these. What do they actually now mean going forward?
So these agreements mean several things. At the most basic level, it means that the tax for entry into the United States has gone up by 15 to 20%, more if you have a big trade surplus. So that's the first thing. So access to the US market is impaired. Secondly, for countries which have deep pockets, and this is a region which has deep pockets, they will also be induced to make investment commitments. Whether anyone follows through on those commitments, who knows? But this will be how the game is played. So if you think about it, access to the United States as a membership fee, a bit like a gym membership fee, it's gone up dramatically. Okay, that's one thing to see. So that the next thing that we are beginning to see is an insistence by the United States on alignment on security and foreign policy, and this will be an important feature too. So you've seen the pressure put on Canada not to recognize the state of health. This is just one example of what we will see going forward, and I am told by officials in governments that there are many more things that have been asked about which have not been made. So the US is, and by the way, we know the US has used trade policy in the past to reward security allies and to punish those who are not seen as allies. The Americans will increasingly use trade as one of the instruments which, where they will say, are you with us or against us? And there is no halfway house. And then that's another signal that's been sent. A third signal I think is being sent, of course, is about the state of trade governance at the global level, where the Americans could not be clearer in their doubts about the efficacy of the World Trade Organization and its rulebook. Now, of course, we can get into how how that might play out for the rest of the world, but the Americans made it very clear that this current set of arrangements just isn't working for them. And so in that sense, there is no fallback option there. And in terms of fallback options, of course, countries that had free trade agreements with the United States haven't against the demands of the current administration. So I think there's a lot we learn about this. The era of some degree of certainty in trade relations, at least on the part of the United States, has gone out the window. And there is this belief in Washington that access to the United States market is a price which countries are willing to pay.
Where does this leave countries like Canada? I mean, you mentioned the pressure they're under, for a foreign policy objective and what have you. Where does it leave Canada? Maybe better off than Mexico, for example, right? And other countries, and then other coalitions.
I think what we have is that we have three of the United States. Actually, we have America's top three trading partners: Canada, Mexico, and China, for whom they have not managed to stabilize a type of deal. Part of this, I think, is part of what we're learning here is a realization on the American side that these three trading partners could do a hell of a lot of damage one way or another if they wanted to get nasty. China has shown that it is not afraid of retaliation. Canada has from time to time bared its teeth. The Premier of Ontario threatened, absolutely freaked out the White House. We saw that reaction within 24 hours to that one. They were really stunned that this had happened. This could happen. And so I think there's a sense, when I read what's coming out of Washington there, that they understand that this is not just a simple matter of the US being able to throw its weight around. So then you've got to get down to, well, what is a deal? What could a deal look like? And here, I think there you get big divergences across the three. The Chinese, it's not in terms of changing their underlying model. Mexico seems to be handling the situation remarkably. Yet at the same time, they have very clear, there's a huge number of investments in their country devoted to supplying the US market. And Canada has done well or badly. And Prime Minister Trudeau wasn't so lucky. Prime Minister Carney was lucky until last week. It's more difficult. And so I think these three are the big three which remain to be settled. And although we had a lot of drama last week with the trade policy tariff announcements from many. The big three have yet to be settled, and these three account for 41%. And so it's a big deal, and it's still unfinished work. And it will be interesting to see how the Americans modulate their position once they realize they don't have all the cards, which I think they now know.
So now the geopolitics of trade is not about trade. This is the weapon. Now you talk investment, we talk energy, we talk technology. All of these things now are subsumed, and I'm not going to arena. Just stick to this. What really does it mean?
Well, I think so. The one other thing will be on the of course, the critical minerals, rare earths. So let's unpack this a bit, because I think there's a lot here which people need to bear in mind, and I don't think it's sunk in yet. One of the reasons why countries are willing to open up their trade in the first place with another country is the expectation that the other country will supply them with the goods when they need. If I think that you're going to close your exports to me as some form of punishment in the future, I'm going to be very reluctant to liberalize to you in the first place. So what we learn from this is that much of the opening that we've seen since World War II is implicitly predicated on the assumption that governments do not resort much to export rare earths and ore. This is a central, underlying and hidden necessary condition for open trade, and it's being seriously eroded at the moment. And this, I think this is one key. The second key part is that as globalization has unfolded, many companies have sought to expand globally, including investing abroad. And in the old days of FDI, foreign direct investment, cross-border acquisitions were welcomed in most countries. Now that's not so clear. Now nationality begins to matter again. A third way in which this matters is national passports. American citizens cannot undertake certain transactions, even when working for a foreign company, with certain designated countries like Russia. There are some real limits. So nationality is creeping back in. And what we're learning, and certainly what we're seeing at IMD when we're dealing with lots of more and more companies, is they built their business strategies on a one world model. One company equals passports don't matter. We hire this, it's gone. That's going. Because now we have, when you can talk to companies, you will have staff members who are extremely upset about developments such as what's going on in Gaza. This causes a lot of discussion, and in ways that HR departments never ever thought about. So this whole geopolitical backdrop is changing in ways that are undermining trust and will profoundly change how companies organize themselves across borders. And I think this, again, you started with what are we not looking at? What are we missing? Where is it? 5 or 10 years, this will all be much clearer as people realize that the corporate structures we put together to benefit from the latest phase of globalization need to evolve to the next phase of globalization.
So let's bring it home now. Saudi Arabia, you've got the visions in Saudi Arabia. And here also the transition away to 2050 and all this. What does it mean? How will this emerging geopolitical environment actually affect their transition plans and of course,
So I think there are going to be quite a number of implications, but let's start with one important contextualizing point here. The country that's choosing to marginalize itself is the United States. The question will be how many of its allies and friends it brings with it. And so this is one thing to bear in mind. Even if the US brings with it, there will still be, there's still over 200 customs territories out there. What the units we think about in international trade, which want to trade and want to engage. And so there will be space for countries which are trusted connectors. And this, when I look at so much of what's happening in this region, the countries here are positioning themselves to be trusted connectors. They're not going to try and avoid choosing sides. They're not going to pick fights, but they're essentially will try and stay open and connected. And so I think that part of the strategy becomes even more valuable. That's one thing. The second thing, of course, is that what we're seeing in the United States and in some other countries is a lot of policy instability, a hell of a lot of policy instability. And this region has offered, by and large, extremely clear signals to the private sector. Again, another big plus. Third, as the US goes off in its own direction and Europe continues to stagnate, There will be homes for, where are the next sort of innovative industries going to come from? Where will they be located? Where are the people going to get educated? The whole knowledge economy side of these two countries' strategy we talked about, I think is very well placed, extremely well placed. So I think so put it together, I'm quite bullish about this region because I think the choices that have been made are by and large the right ones. There will have to be strategic adaptations. There will be presidential visits from the United States with the begging bowl hanging out for more investments. This will have to be. So I think there is there's space for it. There was one thing in our discussions beforehand where there was a question. Well, should these countries act in a strategic way? Yes, with respect to their own development, but not with respect to geopolitics. You want to be seen as the neutral player.
Fantastic. But then the concept of resilience, right?
Yes.
I mean, in this environment of volatility and changing policies and changing alliances and what have you, right? And changing rules of the game that would define resilience for countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, others, right? That have tried to remain connected across.
So this is how my thinking on this is evolving. Let me explain where I'm at. We are in a situation where no one can really know how these different pieces shake out, whether it's on the geopolitical side or on the technological side. So this is what the statisticians call an era of deep uncertainty. We do not know the outcomes. We don't know how likely each outcome is. And we don't even know how we're going to get to one or there's disagreement about how the world can unfold. So in the situations of deep uncertainty, what's the right way to play this? First, ask yourself, what's the right objective? Is it to maximize your growth, or is it to ensure that no matter what happens, a really nice minimum level of growth is accomplished? That's a very important difference. For companies, especially Western companies, this is mind-blowing, right? Because you're not saying, let's maximize shareholder return. You're saying, let's ensure we have a minimum which keeps the company alive and delivers enough resources to enable us to do the second thing, which is to pivot, right? The second thing you learn when you start reading about deep uncertainty is that you want to have economies or firms which have the resources to be able to experiment, and then if something works, scale up fast. So this is second feature. And then I think the third feature, and here it really helps to think, if you're an economy and a government, you should think in these terms. Think of your economy as a portfolio of different activities. You don't need every portfolio to survive. Every element in your portfolio to be a winner. So if you have 1,000 different activities, 1% die or don't make it, okay. Think like a venture capitalist. The success rate does not have to be 100%. But you need to have enough successes to keep the show on the road, generating that nice, comfortable margin of growth, which generates the resources which enable you to make those experiments and scale up what you need to in the future. So I think it's a model which is based more on thinking about deep uncertainty. It'll take governments in a slightly different direction, I think, or one where actually you'll end up thinking a lot more like a California.
I did not think about it this way, but fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm going to push a little bit on this, right? Because yes, the portfolio may not, some elements in the portfolio may not matter, but some elements are actually inimical to the raison d'etre of a state. So how do I actually protect those, right? The values, the culture, whatever you call it.
So
even if they're not monetized.
Understood. And and of course it is important to get the answer to this question. Let me explain why. I live in Switzerland, and one of the most amazing features of the 20 years that I've lived in Switzerland is to see how everyone understands in Switzerland that the country is too small to stay rich if it just sells locally. It has to engage globally. Yet at the same time, this is a country with incredibly rich and strong traditions, and often very local-based traditions too. Right? So each town and canton or province has its own traditions, and the Swiss go out of their way to celebrate those. So people can see that our past is respected, but we are going to be confident as we go forward in the future. So that type of mindset, I mean, I would be very keen to learn if that could be adapted to other places. Now, to be frank, when I come to this region, I see countries, I think, finding a forward with exactly the same sort of approach, which is how do we pay our respects to the past and honor the past, and yet at the same time keep ourselves open. And then to get into the more specifics of this, when you get into which traditions or economic activities are absolutely pivotal, then you have to have a very clear sense about what the threats for them are. Okay, what could undermine them? And as I argued earlier, when it comes on the trade side, mushrooming of security concerns is going to be one thing which governments are going to have to stay on top of as well. Then the second thing in terms of social culture and the like, the developments that we are seeing in social media and the like will be important too. And we can see in the West what the implications of certain social media platforms have been for polarization of politics and division within society. And I imagine there are some countries around the world which look at that and say, we don't want that here. So there, again, figure out what you need to protect and why, and then figure out the threats, and then decide which of the technological opportunities that present themselves are the ones that you actually want.
Fantastic. And this is what brings us to the role of technology.
Sure.
Right? And let's bring it also back to trade, right?
Yeah,
so how can we harness the powers of technology within the, say, friendlier trade environment?
Sure.
Looking ahead.
Here, I think it's really helpful to step back from the day-to-day trade policy soap opera about tariffs, which is, of course, what's absorbed most of our time, and rightly so in the past few months. You and I know, having looked at trade flows for decades, we know that the levels of trade that we see in the world are much smaller than what they should be on the basis of tariffs. So tariffs are not the only thing that's going. Of course, we've got non-tariff barriers and all the rest of it. But if you unpack this, when people try to look at the costs of trade, differences in language, differences in buying habits, lots and lots of paperwork still in customs, all of these things have and continue to hold back trade.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And one of the interesting things we're seeing, whether we look at others, they are all trying to find ways to strip paperwork out and offer end-to-end solutions, but at least that's my perception, to their customers. And that's because the millennial-old project of cross-border trade is still really, really paper-driven in many cases. And this is problematic. Now, last 10 years, we've seen quite a lot of progress on trade facilitation, but no one thinks this process is over. And every time I read about AI and the application of blockchain and other technologies to cross-border trade, it's the same story. Let's just get those trade costs down. Here's a positive way then it might tie into what you said earlier. Okay, we may be moving to a world where there's a lot more cross-border taxes, import tariffs for some jurisdictions like the US. But that doesn't mean the rest of the world has to buy into this. There's an agenda, and there are companies out there to strip out trade costs and to integrate more. And I think that's ultimately what these technologies will do in ways that we cannot even fathom.
So let me unpack this. So I think there's good news and bad. So the good news is that the very technological developments that we talk about will make cross-border delivery of services even easier and increasing offerings for people. This is in principle good. Of course, as the service sector comes in national economies, comes under more and more cross-border competition and faces that, then it will induce a backlash. Okay? And it will induce a backlash. And then the question is what form that backlash takes. Does it take the form of cross-border transactions taxes? Does it take the form of profit taxes, which could be discriminatory? You charge foreigners higher levels of profit taxes than domestic firms. Let us not underestimate the creativity of politicians who are desperate to protect local constituencies. One of the unspoken truths of the last 25 years, 30 years, is that the manufacturing sectors of the world have become incredibly competitive and efficient. Anyone looking for a quiet life should not go and work in manufacturing. Anyone looking for the 1960s nostalgia, big production plants, thousands of employees, this is not happening. That's not what modern manufacturing is about. It's an intensely competitive area, and the service sector is going to move in that direction. And there will be a pushback because not everyone who wants to work in the service sector necessarily was up for that level of competition, and they might not feel that they're prepared enough to be able to thrive under those circumstances. And this will be part of the adjustments which societies will face, and it may well be one of those areas where some countries decide they want to go a lot slower, precisely because their labor forces are not up to it. And again, here we can begin to deal. The old point that your ability to be able to capitalize and benefit from globalization depends critically on your educational and training institutions really comes home. So let me break down my answer in several parts. So first, I have long advocated that the European Union and the member states in particular take much more seriously the productivity deficit that they have with other parts of the world, and the innovation deficit as well. So this is an area which, in my view, we should have been working on for a long time. We have, of course, as you said, the Draghi report, the simplification program of the current commission. Let's see what that actually delivers, because I cannot see officials in Brussels willingly giving up their influence over certain industries now that they have. So I have some skepticism about that, which makes me a little bit bearish about how Europe's economy can then bear these additional burdens, which brings me to the second point. Yes, you're right. The defense spending is gearing up. This is just the beginning of the problems that Europe will face here, because you can, although you can fight wars with drones these days, you still need a lot of people on the ground. And how many young Europeans had spending 3 or 6 months a year on the Eastern Front on their checklist of things to do? That has not happened. It is difficult to get Ukrainians under the age of 25 to sign up. Try asking Spanish or Portuguese young people to sign up. So I think there's going to be that's going to be a very, very profound conversation which will have to happen across the generations within Europe, because younger people in Europe feel like they have been screwed by older generations who've got all the good jobs, who've been able to afford their houses, the long list of complaints that they have.
And left them with the legacy of debts.
Yeah, no, I mean, they're not happy. I mean, I spent 20 years teaching them in Eastern Switzerland, and they are not happy. And if anyone thinks that that rearmament is going to will involve mandatory conscription and things like this, there is going to be a serious backlash there. So Europe has structurally made a lot of very bad decisions. I would argue it has been on a holiday from history for 30 years. It was a lot of fun, maybe, but we didn't use that time particularly well, and the resources which were freed up by having lower defense spending, we didn't use that particularly well. And now we find ourselves in a nutcracker, where one part of the nutcracker, one arm of the nutcracker is Russia, which is posing a very, very serious threat to the eastern part of Europe. And now the other part of the nutcracker is the US saying, well, we're not going to pay for this anymore. And then I guess if you want to have, if you could have a three-sided nutcracker, I'm not sure you can, then you would also point to the competitive threat from Asia, and I don't just mean China. I mean, Asia is back. It was always a force in the world economy until the 18th century, and now Asia is back, and so Europe we have to adjust it now. If you want to, and I don't want to end on too negative a note, because Europe has a lot of resources. We have a lot of extremely well-educated people. We need to get our act together if this is going to work out well. And there has not been that mobilization yet to make this happen. We will see. We will see. Now, you asked specifically about the deal that's signed. I mean, Chancellor Merz put it very well. He said, look, this deal is going to hurt Germany, but it's the best available option we have. And I think the reason he's right to say that is because Europe is beholden to the US on defense grounds. And if we want to keep, quote, we want to keep the Russians out, we have to keep the Americans in. And that defined the price.
And that defines the price, and that differentiates between the EU and China. China can hold and say, get an extension on the 1st of August deadline, whereas Europe could not have
The nostalgia for manufacturing in the United States is, I think, very, very heartfelt by the current president. And just to put this in context, it was Napoleon Bonaparte who said, if you want to understand a man's worldview, look at the world when he was 20. Donald Trump was 20 in 1965, when the share of US manufacturing in US GDP was 20%, where manufacturing was a male-dominated activity, where the share of immigrants in the United States labor force was at its lowest level in the 20th century, where the US was militarily dominant, right? And I don't want to argue this explains everything that he believes, but I think Napoleon's insight is absolutely spot on and takes you a long way. The world, of course, has moved on since then. Manufacturing plants now are much more capital intensive, now even more robots intensive, and their jobs in manufacturing plants are increasingly ones, with some exceptions, which are very, very high skill. So the idea that we're going to be able to go back to the levels of employment that we saw in the 60s in US manufacturing is not going to happen. Okay? It's not going to happen. Let me say two other things. I think there's 2 other lessons here. One fact that no one talks about in the case of US manufacturing is that US manufacturing employment falls the fastest when the US is in recession. Yeah. It's got nothing to do, well, let me put it this way, very little to do with China. Okay? If you actually plot the statistics over time, it's extraordinary. You take out the recession periods and there's not much in terms of your client left. Yeah. So that's, I think, a super important point about manufacturing in the US. The last point to make is a pretty depressing one. And that has to do with the populist politics in many countries, not just the United States. The playbook for populists is build the movement. That's priority 1. Priority 2 is win power. Priority 3 is keep power. And maybe priority 4 or 5 is do some good. So we have an administration which is determined publicly to revive manufacturing. It won't happen. We know this. In fact, let me put it this way. I don't know a serious card-carrying economist who thinks that this will happen. But that doesn't matter for them, for the administration, because they'll find someone else to blame next time it comes around. And in fact, and so that's why I fear, that's why this cycle has persisted. And I would argue that the current president is not the first person to campaign for president of the United States on a flawed platform for reviving manufacturing. This language has been going on for almost 20 years. Yep. So it's a playbook which the American political class has perfected. Now it's just been taken to an extreme level with the tariffs. Okay, that's a second is, and you sort of bring in OPEC. You're quite right. This is it's a key commodity which this region has some control over. It's a double-edged sword, right? On the one hand, it gets you a seat at the table, but on the other hand, it raises expectations and makes you a potential target for action by any number of players. Yeah, and so again, there is going to be a bit of a tension in this region, and maybe the smaller players in this region can play this better than the bigger players. That if you want to be seen as a trusted connector, you can't be seen to be taking sides or playing favorites or leveraging too much your position for short-term strategic advantage. So this again it's a balancing act. I'm sure the sophisticated thinkers in this region are figuring out how to grapple with that, but it's difficult. Yeah, it's difficult because if you want to be trusted, to be even-handed, you can't be seen to be playing games.